Hi, greetings to you. And this is another round of PAD 742 and part of our concluding lectures for the semester. And our topic for today will be premised on why there's the need for development administration. In the last class we discussed development administration and we're able to look at the successive developmental plans that were put in place in Nigeria prior to independence and post-independence, and we began with the 1942 to 1946 development plan, which was largely a pre-colonial arrangement that was targeted at stimulating development within the confines of the Nigerian state. In the light of that fact, we saw clearly every effort, both structural and institutional, that was put in place to stimulate development, and the extent to which it was followed about ensuring that the pre-colonial state of the Nigerian society and other third world society was able to pursue development, although under the dictates and supervision of the colonial powers. That to a large extent had its challenges that necessitated the formation of another national plan. And within that space of time, there was the 1952 to 1958 development plan, which also was largely pre-colonial, but however laid the framework and foundation for other development plans. And then eventually we had the 1962 to 1968 plan, which was post-independence and was considered as the major development plan or the first major development plan in Nigeria. And that followed through up until the successive plans that we had from the period of independence up until the periods of the early 90s. So one would ordinarily ask, why development plans? Or what are the ideas and agendas behind the formation of development plans? It is easy for everyone to discern that for there to be successes in any arrangement or any endeavor, there is the need for planning, there is the need for evaluation of the processes, there is the need for adequate supervision and strict adherence to the set out plans. So if one looks at it historically, it is easy for one to discern the fact that the whole idea that revolves around development planning emanated from the centrally planned economies of Europe upon the collapse of what was known as the centrally planned economy. It has its origin after the period of the First World War, where the world experienced some global challenges that necessitated states to go into other arrangements beyond what was known to be the order of the day, and with particular emphasis on the Soviet Union. Because of the arrangements that they have and how central their planning processes are, it was easy for them to pursue a development agenda that other developing countries, upon attainment of independence, saw the need to step into that arrangement and pursue their own development idea. And the reason is simple. During the global economic crisis, the countries of the Soviet Union, of the then Soviet Union, were more or less immune to the global crisis owing to the centrally planned arrangement that was put in place. So it was only normal for people to now see that the other aspect of the world, where the free market forces of demand and supply held sway, collapsed almost uncontrollably within the economic crisis that was experienced at the time. But on the other side of it, which is the socialist bloc or the Soviet Union bloc, was immune to that arrangement, owing to how their economies were centrally planned and how the idea of development administration and planning was put in place by those countries. So upon attainment of independence, so many countries borrowed that idea and sought to pursue development in that direction. To add to that also, the Western countries that were not immune to the global crisis brought about state interventionist ideas and plans on how to counteract the crisis of the global economy that was experienced at that time. So if you lay too much claim and emphasis on the forces of demand and supply to dictate what happens in the market, it therefore means that there shouldn't be state intervention in the economic arrangement of the country. But when the global economic crisis hit the Western countries so hard, they resorted to borrowing ideas from these centrally planned economies. And that brought about the issue of, you hear bailouts in today's global language, you hear of state interventions to cushion the effect of the global economic crisis and all that we experienced not quite long. So that has a history, and it was followed through in the first global economic crisis that was experienced shortly after the First World War. So the whole concept of development administration gained prominence after the Second World War and was pursued vigorously up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the free market economy took precedence or preeminence in economic affairs globally. So that notwithstanding, countries continue to pursue development with the ideas and agendas of transforming the lots of the economy into what would fare well for all and sundry within such an economy. So this idea of development planning is a borrowed leaf from what one would call the socialist arrangement. I remember when we began these lectures, we discussed various theories of development. We looked at the modernization theory and its own argument that talks about various scholarly views that talks on how developing countries can attain development and the practices that they must follow to attain development. Then we now saw, on the other hand, the arguments of the underdevelopment and dependency theories that, to a large extent, has its apron strings to the ideas and agendas of the socialist bloc, or what one would say Marxist theories, where they hold the practices of Western capitalism as a resultant effect of the underdevelopment of these third world countries. So with all these arguments, it can be said that the development agenda being pursued by these underdeveloped countries to attain development revolves around a gamut of factors. And like we said in one of the classes, we looked at how the civil service was deployed into pursuing development agenda. And the last lecture that we had and the videos posted on the WhatsApp group, we saw how development planning became a central idea in the pursuit of development. And we examined the various development plans, ranging from the institutional setup, the structural arrangements that was put in place, and the various policies and programs that was injected into the system to pursue development. We looked at how various plans focused on agriculture, others focused on industrialization, others focused on the social needs and welfare of the people, ranging from health to infrastructural facilities, and even the welfare of the civil service. And we saw reforms that took place, ranging from the indigenization policies to the nationalization policies. All these are efforts to pursue development as a way to counteract the challenges of underdevelopment. And if you remember very well also, in one of the lectures, we discussed the features of underdevelopment. However, in today's class, we will be looking at why planning is necessary and why countries set up planning arrangement. Let me share my screen with you so that you will see why planning is necessary and why countries would always pursue certain ideas of development planning as a way to stimulate growth and development, both in the economy and in the societal life of the people, and in the attainment of the material well-being of the people as well. So we'll be as brief as possible today to ensure that we attend to the questions that were raised. I saw a list of questions from somebody on WhatsApp group, and then we'll give room for everybody to make contributions and equally ask their questions so that we can address all that before your exams next week. So we said that national planning is usually prepared according to specific periods, but it can vary according to duration, ranging from 1 year to even 50 years and beyond. We can have short-term plans of 1 or 2 years, medium-term plan 5, 7 to 8 years, and long-term plans or perspective plan of 10, 15, 20 to 50 years and even beyond. Following the socialist revolution in Russia in 1917, this is more of a historical analysis of the whole idea of development planning. Private ownership of the means of production was abolished. With that went private enterprises and the free market mechanism as vehicles for economic development. Planning and public enterprise were instituted in its place. The results were remarkable. The state mobilized high rates of public savings and investment. Capital accumulation and national income grew at unprecedented rates. By the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union emerged as the second big power in the world. In about 4 decades, from a situation of underdevelopment and backwardness, the Soviet Union became a developed country. This was thus a very successful example of planned economic development for the countries developing later to learn and emulate. The strategy adopted by third world countries was greatly influenced by the Soviet experience. However, with the collapse of socialism, planned economy gave way for a free market system in Soviet Union, which is one of the countries of the Soviet Union today, and most prominent during the Soviet Union era was Russia. So you may have heard about the Great Depression of 1929, it's also called the World Economic Crisis. What happened was that the market system, especially in the industrial countries of the West, grounded to a halt. There was overproduction, stock of unsold goods piled up, factories were shut down, share markets collapsed, unemployment soared uncontrollably. All this meant a complete mismatch between production and market demand. It had been known that the free market system did not ensure smooth development of an economy based on private enterprises, but the Great Depression made it crystal clear for everyone to see. So it goes further to buttress the point that we made earlier on, that the whole idea of development planning gained prominence after the period of the Great Depression, that it was seen clearly that the countries of the Soviet Union, that so many countries that made up the Soviet Union at that time, were immune to the global economic crisis, even though it ravaged the economies of the Western world. This bloc of countries that came together to form the Soviet Union, due to the centrally planned arrangement that they had, and due to the socialist principles that they operated on, were not hit by this crisis. So it became an eye-opener for so many countries upon independence to borrow their ideas and pursue development. But sadly enough, or unfortunately enough, as one would rather put it, the Soviet Union collapsed due to some policies, although not within the confines of our discussion, but I would still mention them here, known as glasnost and perestroikal policies, where they gave room to private ownership of properties and to the forces of demand and supply to guide how the economy was managed by one of their leaders then, Nicholas Gorbachev. So he was the one that brought that idea, and that idea saw to the collapse of the Soviet Union into so many countries. And after that time, the free market economy gained prominence in global affairs. But the idea here projected is the fact that these countries, as at that time, did not experience the global crisis that the world was faced with. So it became a learning curve for the newly independent countries to borrow the idea of development planning and to centralize development as well. And Nigeria pursued that within its own confines to a considerable extent. So having said that, incidentally, one should also note that the Soviet economy, being a planned economy, remained unaffected by the Great Depression. How was the crisis of the Great Depression handled? By state intervention. The states in the badly affected countries of the West intervened to push up market demands by undertaking public works and financing them by money creation, printing currency notes, and also as deficit financing. This step generated additional income and employment. Market demands for goods and services gradually picked up as a result of state intervention policies. Let me pause here and explain an idea. You know, when we talk of socialism or even communism, we talk about total control of the commanding heights of the economy. The production of resources or material well-being is dictated by and controlled by the government of the day. In other words, there is an extent to which private property can be owned because all properties are owned by the government and everybody contributes to a common cause and they share from that common cause. That is the whole idea of socialism. So imagine a country now that talks about emphasis on forces of demand and supply to dictate what happens in the economy, individuals to own private properties. But when depression came in, they now borrowed the socialist idea of government intervention in deciding the economy and to curb the crisis that took place or that was experienced within the economy. So it therefore means that one cannot entirely lay claim to any country of the world practicing one particular system, because not too long ago, we experienced another global economic crisis, and we heard of state intervention, governments stimulating production, buying goods and services to help the people to ameliorate the challenges of the economic crisis and all that. So it was what the Western countries adopted as a measure to counteract these challenges. So in other words, they also borrowed the idea of development planning from the Soviet bloc when they had this crisis. So we continue by saying that market demands for goods and services gradually picked up as a result of state intervention policies. In the course of time, normalcy was restored and development resumed. This course of state intervention is also known as the Keynesian solution of the economic crisis, after the name of the was named after the famous English economist J.M. Keynes, who had provided the economic theory on which this solution was based in the United States. This course of state intervention came to be known as the New Deal. The experience of the Great Depression had, apart from other things, one very major effect: the faith in laissez-faire state, a fence-sitting state not actively intervening in the economic life to control the functioning of the market, was shaken. Since then, state intervention in the market system, wherever necessary, became a normal feature of capitalist countries. Secondly, as noted earlier, the state in these countries oversee the economy and engages in indicative planning, where the state does not actively play a role in economic development, but merely indicates the direction in which private enterprises is to move. Finally, it plans for and undertakes public works, especially in the field of social infrastructure. Such development in the developed capitalist countries following the Great Depression had a lesson for the developing countries. The lesson was economic development could not be left wholly to private enterprises based on the free market economy. The state had a role to play in it. Shortly after the experience of the Great Depression came the Second World War. It necessitated not just state intervention in the capitalist and fascist countries like Germany and Japan, but an overall control of the economy, its regulation and production planning for meeting the war needs. So the high point of this discussion is premised on the fact that one single practice, be it of the Western idea or of even the socialist idea, cannot entirely hold sway when one discusses economic affairs. But a combination of these factors would stimulate greater development and greater sustainability of the economy in various countries. And that explains why the newly independent countries that gained independence in the 60s and beyond borrowed these various ideas. In some instances, you see private ownership of properties. In other instances, you see government control of properties. And the budget system as it is run in Nigeria today and most parts of the world today is premised on government control of the economy to set the agenda for both private and public sectors to follow. And that, to a large extent, is considered as the best tool for pursuing development, especially for underdeveloped societies. So this is what is known as planning of the wartime economies. After the war, rehabilitation and reconstruction required the active role of the state. This historical experience favors centralized planning. Alongside the above arose the notion of a welfare state, which finally came to be accepted in practice in all market economies after the war. Apart from its interventionist role, the welfare state also has to correct the negative aspects of market-based development concerned with the wider issue of social welfare. In the developed countries of the West, the state makes a sizable expenditure on old age security, on employment benefits, health, education, and such other social services. All these are known as social security or welfare measures. Remember, when the argument is made that capitalist countries rely on the forces of demand and supply, or price mechanism, or the free market economy to pursue its development agenda, it is necessary for one to look at these high points and argue that they are not entirely capitalist countries. Because if you say it has to be based on the forces of demand and supply, why is the state intervening in providing welfare services to old people, or even giving social security packages to unemployed people and all that? So in other words, they also rely on centrally planned arrangements to pursue the economic goals of this environment. We see that in various countries. They call it sometimes bailout, or they call it within our own society. I think we have seen trader money, so many other kind of government interventionist arrangements. So in other words, we practice a mixed economy, and most countries of the world are premised on this mixed economy arrangement. So all these are known as social security or welfare measures. Provisions for all this requires planning. A major negative effect of market-based development, which has emerged lately, is environmental pollution with ecological degradation. The welfare state is required not only to protect the environment and the ecology, but also to conserve and plan for restoration and development of the natural resources. The free market mechanism based on the accounting of private profit does not provide for this. This also is a historical experience favoring development planning. The field of development administration can also be said to have started in the developing countries after World War II. After this war, the colonies started agitating for independence, and many of them got it. However, most of the newly independent countries were poverty-stricken, for the masses had been led to expect that independence would bring about an immediate improvement in their conditions. The non-realization of this expectation in turn bred a mood of impatience. Thus, improvement needed to be effected as speedily as possible, or the mood of impatience would explode into violent reactions, which would engender, if not destroy, the state itself. The argument there made is that upon attainment of independence, these countries were made to understand that they can transform the lots of the citizenry using political power. But that was not sufficient enough, as the economic aspect was missing. And that sought to a lot of crisis and even military intervention in politics, breakdown of law and order and war situation in so many countries. And that necessitated the implementation of this development administration agenda premised on centralized planning. So when that came into effect, countries since then have, even though not gotten it right due to other economic challenges, there's a part of development that is state controlled and to a large extent still caters for the needs of all and sundry. The government of these nations quickly realized that the idea of gradual development might not serve their purpose well. They were convinced that relevant administrative theories and procedures would have to be adopted to modernize their economies and accelerate developments to be equivalent, eventually to those of the West. Because there was a chronic shortage of capital, money or wealth used to start a business, and capital markets where money for starting a business is sourced, such that private ownership would necessarily mean foreign ownership. The new nations wanting to preserve their independence closed their doors to foreign investors. It was therefore felt that government was the only agent organized enough to employ its machinery to induce, promote, and manage socio-economic development. Let me pause here and cast your minds back to one of the practices in the development plans that took place in Nigeria. I think basically the one of the 1981 to 85 development plan. There was the indigenization and nationalization policy. I bet a lot of you would have heard of that, where the government saw the need to take the commanding heights of the economy. Very viable companies and organizations were taken charge by the government and given to indigenous people. And the whole idea for that was to ensure that citizens of the country participate in the governance and administration of their own country and in the business environment of their countries as well, instead of being allowed to be run and managed by foreign investors alone. And the challenge with having foreign ownership of various aspects of the economy is premised on the fact that one would experience dumping, unequal exchange rates challenges, difference in scale and measures, and so many other activities that may not augur well with the needs of the indigenous people. So there was the need for that indigenization policy that took place. And the nationalization was the taking over of these various companies by the government. And the digitization idea was to put Nigerians at the helm of affairs of these various organizations. So in order for us to pursue indigenous development agenda, Nigeria also put in place this various plan to show ownership and to reduce foreign control of the economy. So many countries that came into independence as at that time practiced the same arrangement, and it was a measure of the pursuit of development. Because when you allow for unfettered competition or unchecked competition, there's no way that the third world countries will be able to compete with these advanced countries. And that, to a large extent, would kill indigenous efforts at industrialization. And we have seen that play out in so many aspects of our society. So various countries, upon the pursuit of political power, saw the need to take ownership of various companies owned by these foreign investors as a way to pursue development and indigenous pattern of development. So we said that in the post-independence period, government became the prime agent of economic development, providing infrastructure and producing goods and services, often provided through the mechanism of public enterprise. It is possible to describe such planning as an attempt to promote and coordinate through central planning institutions the social and economic activities of central and regional governments with a view to achieving an accelerated national development. It is obvious that such planning presents problems in a federal setup whose principles include the division of power among the levels of government, the existence of a written constitution showing the division and the coordinate supremacy of the levels of government with regards to their respective functions. We shall examine the application of these processes later. So there are also types of planning. Apart from this whole arrangement discussed, there are also types of planning that countries have come up to agree with and to have pursued since independence to date. And the first we have here is operational planning. It's more like the day-to-day planning that we experience in the running of the country and the government in itself. Then there's the strategic planning. This is more of a targeted and focused and purpose-oriented planning that takes place across a period of time. Then there's also the tactical planning. Then the tactical planning is basically a long-term kind of arrangement that is sector-driven and sector, do I say, they focus on particular sectors of the economy. And we said that it includes tactics that the organization plans to use to achieve what's outlined in the strategic plan. Often the scope is less than 1 year and breaks down the strategic plan into actionable chunks. Tactical planning is different from operational planning in that tactical plans also ask specific questions about what needs to happen to accomplish a strategic goal. Operational plans ask how the organization will generally do something to accomplish the company's mission. So these are basically various types of planning that countries put in place, organizations put in place in the pursuit of development agenda. Then there's also the contingency planning. And contingency plans are made when something unexpected happens or when something needs to be changed. Business experts sometimes refer to these plans as a social type of planning. Contingency planning can be helpful in circumstances that call for a change, although managers should anticipate changes when engaged in any of the primary types of planning. Contingency planning is essential in moments when changes can't be foreseen. As the business world becomes more complicated, contingency planning becomes more important to engage in and understand. The idea here now is that if we can still meet or we discuss on WhatsApp, then we'll proceed to cover other aspects of the lecture. But if we cannot have another session because your exam starts on Tuesday, I was thinking this lecture will last for 30 minutes, then question time, and for us to make contributions will last for another 30 minutes. So if you think we should move on, let me know. And if you have questions now to ask, you can bring them up so that we'll discuss them. And if we still have time, we look at other aspects. So you can unmute yourself and make contributions at this point. I can see that we have quite some persons online. So whoever can hear me and have any question to ask, fine, you can ask your questions now. And if we are to continue, we can continue and then discuss on WhatsApp. So whichever way you people feel is best, we should go ahead, because there are other topics that we should look at. And the next one would be the process of planning, which is also not different from what we have discussed so far. It is more like a repetition of our discussions already.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you. Good evening.
Sir, I want to suggest that if it's possible that we
Hello, are you there?
can extend beyond 1 hour, if it's up to you, or we just go through our questions and maybe we'll have to, you can do the recording and send it to us. Then at a convenient time, we can listen to them, the recording version of the remaining parts of the lecture material.
Okay, maybe we should just use like another 5 minutes to run through everything. It's not anything different from what we have discussed. It's about the planning processes, an examination of the structures, the institutions of planning, and all that we have discussed before now. In the last class in particular, everything concerning planning and then the various development plans Nigeria has put in place, we have looked at, and it is not different from what the other lectures, the topics that we have would be centered on. So it is basically looking at the structure of the planning system in Nigeria, the organizations that are charged with planning in Nigeria, which one can say, okay, National Planning Commission, the National Executive Council, the Ministry of Finance and Budget, organizations or institutional arrangements that see to the implementation of government plans and purposes. The Central Bank of Nigeria that is charged with financing government expenditures and all that. So it is more like what we have discussed before now. We all know the role of the National Executive Council, which is made up of the ministers and they're headed by the vice president, and what they discuss relating to various states and economic policies of states, how the ministers also come up with their ideas, how to better the lots of the country and all. So the remaining aspect of our discussion today is centered on the various institutions of government that see to the pursuit of development administration and the implementation of planning processes in Nigeria. Then also external interference or ideas and influence in the pursuit of development in various societies. The role of the IMF, the request for transfer of technology to aid development in underdeveloped societies, issues of stimulating the value of the currency and all that. So it is basically ideas on how to implement government policies and plans. Then a flip side of that as well looks at the issues of development planning in various countries, where we discuss the planning structure and arrangement in India, the planning structure and arrangement in Ghana, the United Kingdom. So it's basically things that if you read through, you can handle on your own. It's not a big deal. However, if you think it's necessary for us to still go over them, it is fine with me. And that would mean us suspending our questions and probably discussing them on WhatsApp. And the aspect of discussing beyond 1 hour, we were told that some other lectures would come up after 1 hour. So I don't know if other members of this class will have another lecture this evening. And I don't know, if I don't keep to the 1 hour, I don't know if it's going to be an issue with the management. But the idea is that every lecture should span across 1 hour to give room for other lectures to also be aired online as well. So if I stay beyond an hour, I might be encroaching into the time of another lecturer. So like I said, they are basically topics that relates to what we have discussed. The only differentials that one would experience from this arrangement would be the structural aspect of it, of which I have mentioned within the Conference of Nigerian States, the structures that have been put in place to pursue development, the efforts of the government to pursue development, and the idea of having a centrally planned economy that comes from the government. Like in Nigeria, for example, it's difficult for us to even say the economy is being planned by private individuals or private organizations. It is basically government planned, and that is the whole idea of development planning. So in summary of it all, it is easy for one to say that the concept and the ideas of development planning came into prominence after the Second World War in the newly independent countries. And the idea is borrowed from the Soviet Union, where the centrally planned economy gained prominence. And the idea behind that, why countries borrowed that idea and interest, is because they were immune to the global economic depression and crisis that was experienced shortly after the First World War. And under that depression and crisis, the Western countries of the world saw their economies crumbling and collapsing, while the Soviet Union waxed very strong within those periods. So there was the need for the new countries upon independence to borrow that idea and pursue development. Even though we saw in the course of our discussion that these Western countries that have laid claim to capitalism and the forces of demand and supply eventually borrowed various ideas from these centrally planned economies to counteract the challenges, the global economic challenges that their countries were faced with. So in other words, it is not entirely safe for one to say every country of the world is capitalist or every country of the world is socialist, as they continue to overlap in their agendas. And where the Western countries in particular run into difficulties, you see there's various governments and states intervening to pushing those challenges. So that is the whole idea of development administration. So I think you can all ask your questions now. Then let's see if we can discuss them. And if we still have the time, we'll meet again. And if we don't, we'll discuss on WhatsApp, since almost every one of you now have a link to the WhatsApp group. So you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. Can you all hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if you have any question, you can ask. Or if you have contributions to make, you can also bring up your contributions. Let other persons equally learn, and together we learn from each other. Oh, you don't have questions to ask?
Look, we are looking for past questions. So we're trying to open past questions.
Okay. If it's from this lecture alone, fine. If it's from other lectures, anything at all, and if you think it's a contribution, it's equally welcome. We will only give a brief explanation and high points of what is expected of you, not necessarily an in-depth response, so that it will not be as if I am preempting the mind of those that will set the exams. We'll just, as you bring them up, we'll discuss them briefly and then move to other ones, so that you go and read on your own and develop your ideas on how to respond to questions. Okay, I can hear you. But are you all on the WhatsApp platform?
Yes, sir.
Okay, or should we go there and discuss it? So that those that are not online.
Bring my laptop back fast. I'm looking for questions.
Okay, so that those that are not online now would also perhaps benefit from reading our responses on the platform.
Okay.
I don't know if that is fine.
It's fine, because we are not much on much in the class, so that's
okay. So we'll use the next 20
so we can drop the
minutes.
questions on the WhatsApp platform.
Yes. You can drop the questions on the WhatsApp platform, and then we'll address them one after the other. Okay. At least on the platform, we can discuss within the next 20 minutes to cover our 1 hour, but we'll be at liberty to throw in our questions anytime between now and your exam period.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so with that being said, I think we have come to the end of the lecture for this evening, and then we'll meet on the WhatsApp platform.
Okay, sir.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.